I thought it would be good to talk about human security in a time of COVID. Now, since Nargis is sharing the screen, how do I turn on to the next slide?
Just a minute. Nargis, can you please put next slide?
How do I tell you next slide? Shall I type your message each time?
We have some technical problems changing the slides or even with sharing.
I'll just next slide.
Yes, just a minute. There is some.
A minute, I will try again.
I could try sharing my screen and see if it works any better. PowerPoint. No, it doesn't.
For some reasons, it's not working.
Oh, yes, now it is on mine. Can you see this, everybody?
Yes, we do.
Okay. I can't, because it doesn't show me the corners, I can't make it big, but you can see it, can't you?
No, that's fine. That's fine. Because...
can you see when I change the slides?
Well, I think, oh, yes. Can you change the slide now? Thank you. Okay. So, welcome, everybody. And I thought it would be good to talk about why I think thinking about human security is so incredibly important at this moment. Because we are living through an existential moment that is a bit like living through a war. I don't know what the figures are in Azerbaijan, but certainly worldwide, literally millions of people have died. And in my own country, Britain, over 100,000 people have died. That's 4 times as many as died during World War II as a result of the Blitz. And can you go back a minute? I'm not quite finished with this slide. Thank you. And I think what's interesting, though, is that it is different from a war because our heroes and heroines are not soldiers, but health workers or care workers. And sometimes the soldiers help them, but that's very different from fighting a war. So that's one reason why I think human security is about anybody who helps you in time of need. And so emphasizing health workers as well as soldiers is really important. But the other issue, which I think is hugely important, is that in the conflict zones we see all around the world, it's extremely difficult to contain the transmission of COVID. It's partly because in conflict zones, healthcare systems are usually quite weak. But it's also because there are things like refugee camps or prisons where COVID spreads. And I think we're never going to solve the COVID problem unless we solve it globally, which means that we really need to think of quite innovative ways of dealing with conflict. And that's really what my lecture is about. Now let's go to the next slide. So I'm going to focus on the kind of why human security is addressing things like war, violent crime, terrorism, human rights violation, or domestic violence. This is not to say that I don't think there are other human problems like poverty, disease. On the contrary, I think they're all connected. But for the purpose of this talk, I want to focus on these kinds of issues. And I think COVID comes at a moment when we're living through a very turbulent period. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci used the term morbid symptoms to describe periods when, as he put it, the old is dying and the new cannot be born. I think the old is the old centralized state, mass production, the use of fossil fuels, the American model of development. And the new is going to be something new if we ever get there, based on thinking about the environment, making use of information and communications technologies, making use of advances in the life sciences. But somehow we can't get there because all our institutions, the state and everything else, are built around the old model of development. If you like, one way of thinking about it is there's a real mismatch between our political institutions and the far-reaching economic and technological changes that have taken place over the last few decades. And what we're seeing, very typical of morbid symptoms, is the rise of authoritarian populism. Shall we move to the next slide? Now, in the past, war has played a very important role in getting out of these kinds of transitions. I think if we think about the Second World War, or even the First World War, or even the Napoleonic Wars, these were deep-rooted political contests in which states really had to adapt in order to win. They tended to very high levels of violence. They were decisive clashes in which battle was key. And I think if you look at the past, these battles played a very important role in restructuring political institutions. The new wars that we face are very, very different. I mean, even if, like in this part of the world, there are momentary clashes, they're wars that go on forever. If you like, they're more like a social condition or a mutual enterprise, and in which most of the violence is directed against civilians. They involve numerous armed groups, both state and non-state, who gain from violence rather than winning. And I think also the problem is it's not just that they go on forever, that they're really, really difficult to end. It's also that they spread through refugees, through forced displacement, through ethnically or religiously based ideologies, and of course they're very much associated with organized crime. So they're extremely different from old wars. They represent, if you like, an extreme form of neoliberalism. Shall we go to the next slide? And I think in contemporary wars, the old methods are actually make things worse. External military intervention makes violence worse. We've seen attempts to have humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect. And I think both the two prime examples are Kosovo and Libya. Both of them stopped the worst of the violence, but at the same time, they empowered armed groups and increased polarization. In Kosovo, ethnic cleansing, displacement of Albanians was speeded up under the cover of NATO bombing. And even though they all could return to their homes, the polarization between Serbs and Albanians was much more extreme. And in Libya, I think the bombing stopped the worst of the casualties. If you think about Syria, where there was no no-fly zone, casualties have been much higher, but they empowered armed groups and left us with this persistent conflict we still see today. And then we have the alternative, which is talks. And the problem with talks is that they're very top-down and they're very difficult to achieve, partly because there may be too many armed groups, but partly because the armed groups will only agree to a compromise if they are guaranteed a position in power. So actually, even where they succeed, like in Dayton, for example, in Bosnia, or the Minsk agreement, which hasn't really succeeded in Ukraine, they entrench the power of the armed groups and they make it very difficult to reach a solution. So shall we go to the next slide? So I think the way to think about it is in terms of human security. That was by way of background. But I want to, in a way, there are very different ways of thinking about human security. And what I'd like to present you with is 3 paradigms of human security, 3 ways of thinking about human security. The first paradigm is often called the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme version. UNDP was actually the first to use the term human security in its 1994, I think, Human Security Report. And for UNDP came out of a long line of thinking during the Cold War period that too much money was spent on the military. More money should be spent on development, and if we spent more money on development, there would be fewer wars and people would be better off. So it was very much about promoting development as an alternative to military spending. And so the focus was very much on addressing poverty, addressing disease, rather than addressing war. I think they had something like 7 different types of security, of which only 1, personal security, really referred to the risks of crime and violence. And I think the UNDP version is very much the version that dominates the United Nations. The second paradigm is what one might call the Canadian version. And this version came out of a different tradition, the human rights tradition, especially after the Helsinki Agreement of 1975. I don't know how many people know what the Helsinki Agreement was, but it's certainly much more significant in your part of the world, probably, than in the West. It was an agreement between the old Soviet Union and the West, in a way to create détente, a sort of easing in the Cold War. But it included a commitment to human rights. And it was after that that many human rights groups started to develop all over the world, strengthening the whole human rights tradition. And I think that's where the Canadian version came out of, the human rights tradition. And in particular, after the end of the Cold War, we suddenly experienced, in this part of the world, in the Balkans, here in South Caucasus, we experienced ethnic cleansing and massive violations of human rights, huge waves of displacement. And so the Canadian version was very much about protecting people from human rights violation, which could mean protecting them militarily. And actually the Canadian version, I think, led directly to the idea of responsibility to protect, the idea that the military should be used in human rights situations. Now, the third version is what I call the Barcelona version, because it was developed by a group who reported to Javier Solana, who was then the High Representative for Common Foreign and Security Policy of the European Union, as an external policy for the European Union. And I think the concern was, yes, we do want to protect people from human rights violations, but we don't want to be the cure. We don't want the cure to be as bad as the disease. That's to say, if you use military forces, it always involves a violation of human rights. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't use military forces, but not in a traditional warfighting way. You shouldn't use military forces to defeat the enemy. Rather, you should use military forces to protect civilians. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But I think the Barcelona version was much more interested in what we call globalization. It was rather, it wasn't about development per se, although development was part of it. It wasn't about human rights violations per se, although that was part of it. the starting point was that human security is what we enjoy in a rights-based law-governed society. In a country like Britain, we expect that if there's a terrorist attack, a fire, floods, that there will be emergency services that will come to our aid, and that the downside risks are in a way protected for by our government. And I think the way we understood human security, the way the Barcelona version understood human security, was somehow in shifting the inside to the outside. We want a world which is governed by human rights and the rule of law. And in emergencies, there should be a global set of emergency services able to come to people's aid. I mean, those emergency services might include health workers, as in the case of COVID. But where there are massive violations of human rights, they might also include the police and the military, but used in a very different way. And so this idea of human security was actually explicitly adopted in the European Union's 2016 global strategy. Okay, shall we go to the next one? So what does human security involve? Well, I think instead of focusing on the kinds of things I mentioned earlier, military intervention or top-down peace talks, it involves a complex, multi-dimensional approach, which is aimed at the security of the individuals rather than one side or the other. In the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, it would be about the security of individual Armenians and individual Azerbaijanis. So what is necessary to secure that? The first and most important thing is to have a political authority that people trust. Actually, we stay safe, not because we have police and military to enforce the law, but because we believe the law is right. And if we believe the law is right, we believe it because we think the institutions that make the law are institutions that we trust. So I'm very aware now in COVID times, even though I've been vaccinated, I'm obeying the rules about the British lockdown because I think it's right to obey the rules. So I think establishing a legitimate political authority really means creating space where people can talk free from fear. And so I place a lot of emphasis on what I call islands of civility. You often find in many, many conflict zones, there are particular places where people have tried to keep out of the conflict. They've tried to keep people together. They've tried, I've come across something like 400 of these local peace agreements in Syria, for example. In one town, Hama, there were 10 families, one of whom was a sheikh who was part of the opposition and 9 of whom were businessmen. And they made an agreement to keep the forces out of their towns. So protecting and expanding these islands of civility is very important. And the final point is, yes, of course, there do have to be talks, but the talks should be considered as an ongoing process, and they shouldn't be only top down. They should be bottom up as well. And they shouldn't be about a final political settlement. That's something that has to involve everybody, that has to involve a constitutional process. Rather, they should be about very concrete things like lifting sieges, ceasefires, and so on. And finally, they have to be inclusive. All the evidence we have is that the more you include civil society, the more you include women, the more sustainable the kind of agreements that are reached. All of this is partly dependent on the economy. In most war zones, young men are unemployed. They have very little choice but to join a militia or to become a criminal. And in very many war zones, there are sort of, in a way, people who've benefited from the war, crony capitalists You could say it's corruption. And so trying to create jobs where people can be paid legally, trying to increase revenue by reducing corruption and being able to provide public services, all of that is part of trying to provide political legitimacy. And finally, I think justice is hugely important in war zones because the kind of wars we're talking about involve a mixture of criminality and political violence. And actually, where violence is directed against civilians, then actually it's not only a violation of international humanitarian law, it's a violation of human rights law. So justice actually, you know, without justice, it's often said peace comes before justice and we have to make peace with these criminal guys. But if you do that, then those criminal guys are entrenched forever and you can't shift the conflict. Can we go to the next slide? So the fourth element of this complex multi is, of course, security. And I do, as I mentioned before, I think we need a human security response force that's both military and civilian. And the aim is to create humanitarian space where people can feel safe, but also they can create the basis of a solution. And I think this involves really a big change in the way the military is used. It's much more like policing than warfighting. It's different from both warfighting and conventional peacekeeping. Warfighting is about winning and using as much force as possible to win. Peacekeeping is about separating the sides. But if the problem is much more against civilians, then you need a different approach. So the aim is to prevent civilians rather than to defeat enemies and to reduce violence rather than to win, to stabilize the situation. Next slide. So I think that in the end, security is absolutely key to the legitimacy. So it's in a way we're looking at a kind of catch-22 situation. We need legitimate political institutions in order to provide security, but we also need security in order to establish legitimacy. And I think traditionally our state security has been based on old war assumptions. Somehow the nation state seems to have been constructed in war for some reason, and nationalism is always associated with symbols of the military. And I suppose my question is this changing with COVID? Is it now being increasingly associated with different symbols? And finally, I think if we are changing from an old war, from a nation state-based system, we need much more role for multilateral institutions like the United Nations and the European Union. And I think they need a different kind of approach to security. They need to adopt a human security role and play a much more active role in conflicts. And finally, I think we come to the last slide. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we could imagine a long-term future in which these kinds of conflicts are more or less permanent and persistent. And I think we've seen that over the last 20 to 30 years here in this part of the world. There's also another way of thinking about human security, which is the sort of Chinese example. Oddly enough, the Chinese are very enthusiastic about human security because they see we need a kind of stabilization in order to protect their investments. So for them, human security is infrastructure plus stabilization and extensive surveillance. And that is a possible option. And the third option, which I think we should now have an opportunity to pursue, is kind of the spread of a rights-based inside. If we take dealing with COVID seriously, and if institutions like the UN and the EU would take their responsibilities seriously in these new conflicts. Interestingly, I've just heard that within NATO, a human security unit has been established. I will stop there